If you printed $1 million in your basement, you'd go to federal prison. But when the government needs $1 trillion, they literally just hit a button on a keyboard. Yet, despite having this magic money button, they still borrow trillions of dollars from other countries, banks, and normal citizens, and they pay billions of dollars in interest for the privilege. Why would anyone borrow something they can literally create for free? The answer to that question reveals the biggest illusion in the modern financial system, and once you understand it, you'll realize why everything you've been taught about money is technically wrong. Let's start with the obvious answer, the one they teach you in high school. Economics, inflation. You've probably heard the story of post-World War I Germany. The Weimar Republic was saddled with massive war debts they couldn't afford to pay. So, the government made a seemingly logical choice. They just started printing more money. At first, it worked. The debts were being paid, but very quickly, the reality of physics caught up with them. The government printed so much paper, money, that the currency became completely worthless. Citizens had to take actual wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. People were using stacks of money as firewood because it was cheaper than buying actual wood. You see, money is fundamentally just a claim on the goods and services in an economy. Imagine a tiny island with exactly 10 apples and exactly $10 in circulation. Every apple costs exactly $1. If the island's leader magically prints 10 more dollars, they aren't suddenly twice as rich. There are still only 10 apples. Now, every apple just costs $2. If you print more money without magically creating more factories, more workers, and more resources, the price of everything simply goes up. It's a hidden, regressive tax on everyone holding that currency. So, to avoid completely destroying their currency, governments borrow money instead. By borrowing money that already exists in the economy, they don't increase the total supply of cash. They just move it from the lender's pocket to the government's pocket. It feels responsible. It feels safe. But that's only half the story. Because there's a much deeper, more surprising reason governments borrow money. And it has absolutely nothing to do with spending. Let's rewind to the year 1999. The United States government was actually running a budget surplus. They were collecting more in taxes than they were spending, which sounds like a miracle today. President Bill Clinton proudly announced a plan to completely pay off the entire national debt by the year 2013. You would think the financial world would throw a parade. Instead, Wall Street panicked. Leading economists freaked out. The Federal Reserve held emergency meetings. Why? Because paying off the debt meant getting rid of U.S. Treasury bonds. And U.S. Treasury bonds aren't just government I owe us. They are the foundational bedrock of the entire global financial system. Let's put this into perspective. Imagine you are a massive pension fund or a massive corporation like Apple. You have $50 billion in cold, hard cash that you need to keep safe. You can't just put $50 billion in a normal checking account. At Chase or Bank of America, normal bank accounts are only insured by the government up to a few $100,000. If that bank makes a bad bet and fails, your $50 billion vanishes into thin air. So, where exactly do you park billions of dollars? So, it's 100% safe and still earns a little bit of interest. You buy government debt. U.S. Treasury bonds are universally considered the safest asset on planet Earth. Why? Because they are backed by the absolute taxing power of the United States. And, more importantly, they are backed by the fact that the United States owns the money printer. The U.S. government will technically never default on its debt, because if they really have to, they can literally just print the money to pay you back. This unique superpower makes government debt the ultimate and undeniable collateral. It is the financial grease that keeps the gears of global commerce turning. Banks use government bonds to back up their daily billion-dollar operations. Entire foreign countries hold U.S. debt as their national emergency savings account. If the government suddenly stopped borrowing and paid off all its debt, this ultimate safe asset would completely disappear. the global financial system would violently break down. There would be nowhere safe to store large, institutional amounts of cash. So, government debt isn't necessarily a sign of failure or irresponsibility. It's actually a financial product that the government deliberately manufactures because the world desperately needs it. Now, forget everything I just said for a second, because there's a third, final layer to this system that is even weirder. When the government borrows all this money, who exactly are they borrowing it from? You might think it's mostly China or Japan, or other foreign countries trying to gain leverage. But the vast majority of U.S. debt is actually owned by Americans. It's quietly sitting in your retirement account, your mutual funds, and your local bank's balance sheet. But a massive, multi-trillion-dollar chunk of it is owned by a very specific entity, the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States. And how exactly does the Federal Reserve buy this government debt? They literally hit a button on a keyboard to create the money completely, out of thin air. Yes, you heard that right. The government officially issues a bond to borrow money, and the central bank unofficially creates new money to buy that exact bond. So the government is technically borrowing money that was just magically printed. They are just using extra steps to disguise the magic trick. It's like writing a check to yourself, depositing it in your own bank account, and pretending you got a raise. In the financial world, this deeply confusing process is called quantitative easing. Why do they do this instead of just directly funding the government? Because directly funding the government is exactly what Zimbabwe and Weimar Germany did. It signals to the world that the politicians have lost control. It's an illusion, a highly coordinated magic trick designed entirely to make the system look responsible. By explicitly separating the printing press from the spending politicians, they create a psychological barrier. It makes us, the public, implicitly trust the currency, because the moment we truly realize the money is infinite, it instantly loses all of its value. The entire system runs on collective, undisputed belief. The national debt isn't a burden waiting to be repaid by your grandchildren. It is simply the accounting mechanism that keeps the grand illusion perfectly alive. So, the next time you hear politicians arguing on television about the national debt, remember that they aren't actually arguing about a massive credit card bill. They're arguing over the source code of the global economy. Anyway, I'm collecting donations in the form of subscribes to fund the next video.